All right. Welcome everybody to the police procedural panel. I'm Kathy Kaminski, the Kathy behind Cozy Up with Kathy. Now you may wonder why someone with cozy in their title is moderating a police procedural panel, but I am a former police officer and I currently work on the forensic unit of a psychiatric hospital. Our panelists are John Mullins, a former police officer who now works as a private investigator, Lissa Redmond, a retired cold case homicide detective, Robert Knightley, retired police officer who also became a lawyer, and Jodé Millman, an attorney. Now, not only are our panelists expert in the field, they are all authors. So I'd like to take a moment, even though we have the link to all your books in the chat, I'd like to go to each one of you and just tell us a little bit about your books. So why don't we start with John?
Okay, first off, I should say that my novel is actually more of a spy mystery novel. It is set in upstate New York with flashbacks to World War I and II. But I have written some short stories along crime, fiction, police procedure, etc. And there are some police procedures in this, but this, I will say I'm proud of this, but this is more of a spy mystery novel. Okay.
Great. Jodé?
Well, my novel, The Midnight Call, was inspired by a true crime that happened in Poughkeepsie, which is my hometown, which is where I live. And it regards the murder of a teen by a teenager. It's a random act of murder that occurs. And in fact, the murder occurred in 1978. It was committed by my high school history teacher. And so it was a story that haunted me for a long time. My story involves a pregnant attorney who was called by her mentor in the middle of the night and said, "I've killed someone, I need your help." And her life circles down the drain from that point onward. So it's fun. It's not it's been termed a police procedural, but it's a legal thriller. It's a combination and a romantic suspense kind of thing.
Okay, kind of cross genres, all of this.
Cross many genres, yes.
Yeah. All right, Lissa?
I am Lissa Marie Redmond, and I write the cold case investigation series set here in Buffalo, New York, where I live. It stars my main character, Lauren Riley, who is a cold case homicide detective, but she's also a private detective. And in New York, you can be both, as John can attest to. You are allowed to be both. And it's her private investigations that get her into the most trouble. It is a straight up police procedural. And even though I am a retired cold case homicide detective, it is 100% fiction. So, but I use what I learned on the job to make it more authentic.
Great. And Robert?
My two, how do I get full picture here? Like that? No? Well, in any case, these are my two novels, very much police procedurals. The first, Buddies in Winter, and the last, The Cold Room. Based on 20 years in the NYPD, retiring as a lieutenant. So long ago, I forget how long. And also, I put as much police procedural as I know into both books, largely the last one, The Cold Room. And my character, Detective Harry Corbin, and his partner, lover, Adele Bentivi, solve the problem. There we are.
Great. All right. Now, so many times as a police officer, I thought to myself, I could write a book about this. Now, obviously, we're all writing fiction, although I think, Jodé, you write some nonfiction as well.
Yeah, I do.
But did things happen to you while you were on duty or at work, on trial, either as a cop or a lawyer? Did any of that morph into fodder for your books? John?
I'd have to say more personal experiences off the job have probably morphed into this book. In college, I had a friend who subsequently went to work for the CIA. Um, let's see, we've had stories about the CIA, operating here in the US, and that's kind of, some of that worked its way into this book. But there's some verbiage I've used in this book that came from, my time in law enforcement and my current time as a private investigator. There's some, again, verbiage and language that I've borrowed from like CSI shows that people could relate to. So, but more stories off the job than on the job.
Okay. Thanks. And Jodé?
Well, that's a very complicated question. For me, it's kind of two-pronged. First, I want to say that the stories that I write, as I said, I live in Poughkeepsie, and the stories that I write are inspired by crimes that have happened in Poughkeepsie. For some reason, we are like a hotbed of bizarre crimes. We've had this situation with the teacher, that really rocked the community because everybody knew this teacher. He taught myself, a lot of my friends. So, I mean, it was the first time that anything like this had ever happened. We've had a serial killer. We had a woman who was discovered buried inside the wall of her house. We had a woman who killed her fiance by tipping over his kayak and pulling out the plug. I mean, literally, it's, the crimes that those to me are going to be stories that are going to turn up in my books that are coming down the road. I like to call it the Queen City crime series because Poughkeepsie is called the Queen City of the Hudson. With regard to what I've learned on the job, I could not have written the book that I wrote without being an attorney, because the basis of the story is to give the reader a 360-degree view inside what a criminal procedure trial is like. Just like being a police officer or a cold case detective, you're learning things on the job and they become so ingrained into you that there's really, the way I found that as an attorney, it was my job to become a storyteller. I was an advocate for my client. I had to persuade a judge. I had to persuade a jury. Sometimes I had to twist my client's arm in order to persuade them that my advice is something that they should follow. And so as a lawyer, I became a storyteller. And so then it came to the point that I wanted to take some of those stories and take some of that experience that I had in the trial room, working with clients. And that's how I wrote my legal thriller, just basically from experience. I could not have done it otherwise. And I'm happy I did it. I'm happy that I was a lawyer. I enjoyed being a lawyer. I practiced matrimonial law. So you can imagine the stories that I heard over the many, many years of practice. But it was definitely something that was woven into what my writing is today and what it will be in the future.
Great. Lissa?
See, I'm a little bit of the opposite. Buffalo may be a big city, but it's kind of a small town where everyone sort of knows each other. So I actually had to go out of my way to make my characters. And even though I use very real places in my series, I had to go out of my way to make sure that I wasn't mirroring in any way any of the cases that I worked on, because I'm still actually in contact with some of my victims' families, and it makes it very personal to me. So I tend to stay away from things that the procedure part I wove into my books, but actual cases, I tried to stay as far away from actual cases that I worked on as I could. But that being said, there's a million stories out there, and the things I saw would, I would see something and think, well, what if this happened instead of this? And one of the beauties of being a detective is you always have a notebook on you. And I found myself writing little ideas in my notebook as the night went on, or as something struck me. And so those are things that I carried with me. And I'm sort of a pack rat hoarder. I have all my notebooks that I ever wrote in my garage, and sometimes I'll pull them out, and those will inspire me to think, okay, what if this happens instead of this? So, and in that way, I do use my experience to make my stories that much more authentic.
Great, thanks. Bob, what about you?
Well, early on in college, I decided that well, I'd always intended to be a writer. And I decided that what I needed to make my stories believable was experience. I needed to go out and have a big life like Jack London or some such thing. And that's what I've done. I was first a newspaperman, then a editor, and then a policeman, and then a criminal trials lawyer, and today a writer, and still a criminal trials lawyer. So everything when I was in the police department, everything I saw, heard, and did became fodder for short stories and novels. And at the moment, I'm working on actually a collection of short stories, my short stories, based on criminal trials I've done and cases I've worked and seen in the police department. And also working on a memoir with the same material.
Great. So now, Bob kind of mentioned this, you've always wanted to write. But for the rest of you, which came first? Your desire to work in the criminal justice system or an urge to become a writer? John?
I'd have to say working in the system first. I didn't really become a writer until about 10 years ago. And I just literally got bit by a bug. Although as a cop and pretty much every other job I've had to write a lot, reports, manuals, etc. So I had the basic skills, but in terms of storytelling and putting it down in a short story or a novel, that didn't happen until about 10 years ago. And prior to that, I would have never thought I'd be where I am today.
Jodé, what about you?
Well, I can honestly tell you that, from the time that I started reading Nancy Drew when I was about 10 years old, I was hooked. I was hooked on mysteries. And I think at that time I wanted to be a writer because I remember sitting down and writing my own, version of a Nancy Drew story. But then it wasn't really, and then it wasn't really until I went to law school and became a lawyer for a while. I always wanted to be a lawyer. From the time I was 14, I wanted to be a lawyer. And part of it was because I read a book that probably is the most influential book in my life, and that's To Kill a Mockingbird. And to me, that was so inspiring, especially since my grandfather was an attorney down in Baltimore. And so we had attorneys in the family. I saw what he did. And for me, that was so inspiring that I wanted to become an attorney. So I can honestly say that after I graduated from law school, I finally had the time to want to write. And so when this murder occurred in 1979, which was the year I graduated from law school, this was a story that percolated and percolated for, I'd have to say, 30 years until I sat down in 2010 to write. Before that, though, and you'd mentioned that I've written nonfiction. I write a guide to Broadway called Seats New York. And what it is it's a seating chart, how to get free seats, how to get the best seats. It's like a savvy theater goer's guide to Broadway and, all of the theaters in the New York area. So I started with that in about 2000 because my father had the project. His untimely death, the publishing company came to me and said, look, we have a bestseller on our hands here. Would you consider A, going out in promotion for him, and B, would you consider doing the series? So I picked up that series. And like I said, that was in 2000. So I did that for about 10 years, wrote a couple of editions of Seats, did one for Chicago. And then finally, I thought that it was really time for me to sit down and really write The Midnight Call, which is what I did in 2010. So a long way of answering your questions is I think an overall arc in my life has been that someday I was going to be a writer, but I needed to, as Bob was, and also, you know, as John, they had to get that experience in their fields first.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, did you have that writing itch early?
From as far back as I can remember. I can remember being maybe 6 or 7, and when everyone else was asking for, you know, Cabbage Patch dolls or Tonka trucks or what have you, I asked my parents for a typewriter for Christmas. And it was a little, I can picture it like it was yesterday. It was a little metal typewriter. It was metal and plastic, and it had these little keys and a ribbon, and I would have to punch down on the keys, and the keys would stick, and I'd have to pry them off. And I used to write for my friends. I don't know if anyone remembers Choose Your Own Adventure stories. I would write those for my friends and give them out as gifts. And those are some of my earliest memories. So I've always been a writer. And as you know, as I got older and, you know, I went through high school, I was still writing stories in high school and into college. But, you know, life happens and I needed a job. And I was taking legal studies at the University of Buffalo, and the Buffalo police exam came up. And I took the exam and I scored really high and got into the police department. I was still in college. I was, you know, a senior in college when I got on the job. So I was very young, and, you know, life kind of got in the way. So when I retired in 2015, after 22 years, you know, my husband and I had a long talk, and he said, if you are serious about writing, and I was, I will support you 100%. And so I threw myself into writing. I joined our local fledgling Sisters in Crime group, of which Kathy happens to be the president of. And I joined Mystery Writers of America and started researching the process of how to become a writer. And all the while I was crafting my book, and you know, the stars just aligned, and I published, my first book came out in 2018. So it really was for me a dream come true, a childhood dream come true.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, it's amazing what happens from our youth just really sticks with us. And then we just kind of hone it into what it is today. Now, I'll make the assumption that you all read crime fiction or watch mysteries on TV. What do you find that they often get wrong, and what annoys you the most? Bob, why don't we start with you?
Well, not so much am I annoyed, but I continue to watch reruns of Law and Order and NYPD Blue. There's nothing more accurate or better done than those two programs. Now, I watched them when they were original, I don't know, 20 years ago, and I've been watching the reruns, 20 years of reruns ever since, and I never get bored by them. And there's nobody who's ever done them better.
Okay, Jodé?
I'll tell you. The mystery witness who shows up at trial. There is no such thing as a witness who gets called at the last minute. You know, it's just, it doesn't happen. There are rules of discovery. In order for you to have someone testify at a trial, there has to be full and complete discovery to the opposite side. And so it drives me up a wall. My husband gets this look of panic on his face whenever he sees me watch one of these movies or television shows, because I want to rip the TV off the wall. But that's one of the things that really upsets me.
Yeah. John?
I'm irritated by the way they portray use of force issues. A cop's involved in a shooting and the day continues on as it would any other normal day. You know, I've never been involved in a shooting, but I've been involved in critical incidents, and your day stops. Your interviews start, your forensic starts, etc. You just don't go back to the office and continue on. So that aggravates me. But I am an old fan of NYPD Blue and Law and Order. I'm sorry, Hill Street Blues especially. That did kind of get, there's enough grit in there. There's enough emotion. I feel a real emotion that those were accurate portrayals. But things like, and I say this knowing my wife's a big fan, NCIS just drives me up a wall. I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
that's what aggravates me the most. But
Lisa, how about you?
Not so much anymore. They seem to be getting better at it, but I can tell you, I have never worn high heels on the job. I had never wore a tank top. I never, I never, and my number one pet peeve, female detectives do not carry purses. Don't ever have them carry a purse. They just don't do it. Like I said, shows have been better about it as of late, but those are some things that really used to bother me. But I have to disagree with John and Robert. My favorite police show of all time is Barney Miller. Sorry. I personally thought that was the most authentic.
I forgot about that one.
Yeah, Barney Miller. Yeah, gotta love that one. Now, not all crime fiction writers write police procedurals, but almost all of them have some sort of police presence. Not all go to court and go to trial, but some do. What advice would you give to crime fiction writers adding in the police presence or court presence in their novels? Bob?
How do I get to be big picture like everybody else? And do
You
see me?
look the same to everybody as I see.
Do I? Okay.
Okay.
Except to me, but it doesn't matter. I remember what I look like. Let me see if I remember the question.
It's what advice would you give to other crime writers on getting authentic police presence?
Take a cop to lunch, all right? Or a lawyer, actually, criminal lawyers especially. Criminal lawyers are gullible people. They love to talk about their work, and they'll tell you everything you need to know. And they're entranced by meeting writers, all right? Newspapermen, fiction writers, true crime writers, any kind of writer. They won't investigate your that you are what you say you are. They're just happy to talk to you. They want to talk about themselves and their work, and but that's what you need. You need somebody on the inside who can tell you how it works. And the cops in the local precincts, you can go there and introduce yourself as a writer to the desk sergeant, ask to speak to the public relations cop, and you'll find somebody to give you all the information you need and all the background. You can do the same thing with lawyers. I imagine criminal lawyers go to a criminal trial, and you can introduce yourself to lawyers in the courtroom at the desks. And everybody's looking to be to have somebody listen to their story and take advantage of that. You'll have to in order to get realistic in your writing. That's it.
Okay, thanks. Jodé?
Well, when I was working on the Midnight Call, not only did it have legal aspects, which I was familiar with, it had medical aspects, and it also had police procedure. So I called upon a friend of mine who just happened to be a retired sergeant from the town of Poughkeepsie Police Department. I picked his brain about police procedure. So that's one thing that you can do is, first of all, if you have to know somebody, that, a friend or relative or somebody who's got a kid that's a police officer, contact them. They're more than happy to speak with you. And like Bob said, lawyers just love to talk about themselves. You can call the Bar Association and ask them for the names of, criminal defense attorneys or whatnot. But, you know, what I also did was I contacted the district attorney's office here in Dutchess County, explained what I was doing, and asked them if I could come over and talk to them, and made an appointment. And again, they were more than willing to speak with me. So I think it's networking. A lot of it is network. Go to your Chamber of Commerce, because they have probably have meetings every month. You know, you could probably run across an attorney or a police officer at an event like that. But it's networking, and people are willing to talk. And you know, and also contact these organizations, contacts your friends and sisters, and you know, at Sisters in Crime, and you know, and I'm sure that there's referrals. If somebody contacted me and said, "Hey, I need the name of somebody in Dutchess County," I'd be more than happy to refer them to the right person.
Super. John?
I would say the same, you know, take a cop to lunch. Now, prior to COVID, I would have also said, go to a couple trials,
Right.
sit through an entire trial, you know, get a feel for the courtroom, the bench, the jury, you know, the attorneys, et cetera.
Right.
And I hope that at some point in time after COVID, we're back to normal. And I would still suggest that. But again, that gives you, like Bob said, that gives you the flavor and the feel, and you know, maybe some of the idiosyncrasies. And you can even, you know, if you're sitting there in a courtroom, you know, take notes on what the ventilation system sounds like, or what the courtroom smells like, etc. But yeah, definitely take a cop to lunch. It's we all like to talk, and you know, and there's also, I guess it would be like taking a magician to lunch. We want to share some of those secrets that the average public doesn't know about, and some of those really odd stories that you don't discuss at home, but you want to share with somebody. Like, you know, years ago, I had to have a conversation, a normal conversation, with a guy that was completely naked and covered in shampoo. Now, there's a story there, but can you tell that story at home? Not without people, your friends and family, looking at you sideways. But if a lawyer came up, or if a writer came up and said, tell me more about that, I would gladly tell him more about that.
Yeah, that's great advice. And yeah, all those stories like that, yeah, you can't quite tell at the dinner table,
Right.
but oh, if you get the right audience, we'd love to share.
You know, but don't expect trials to be exciting like they are on television. They are boring as all get out, and things do not move very swiftly. So you have to have patience if you're sitting in a trial.
Yeah, and all kinds, because trials for different purposes
Right.
are totally different.
Exactly.
And it's good to get a good range. Yeah.
Right.
Lissa?
Well, what I would say is, you also have to remember that even cops, or people who were cops, we don't know everything about everything. So for my last book, part of it was set in Ireland, and it was about art theft, which I didn't work on in cold case. And I don't know anything about being a cop in Ireland. So I had to reach out to a cop in Ireland to find out what their procedure was. And I also had to reach out to someone that was in the FBI art theft squad to find out what their procedure was. So even if I think people think that because you are a cop, you sort of have the inside scoop on everything, but you kind of don't, because you know, there's so many different facets of law enforcement, and, you know, different specialties. Even we have to go and do our research. So don't be afraid, if you don't have a law enforcement background, to ask a cop, a lawyer, you know, someone on a SWAT team, someone, a dog handler, like the other panelists have said, they love to talk about their experiences. And very few people will turn you down if you come with good intentions. So, you know, don't be afraid to ask. And that would be my number one piece of advice, is don't be afraid to ask, because even as police officers, lawyers, law enforcement, we still have to ask. So, you know, put yourself out there. You'll be surprised.
Yeah, I'm looking through the chat right now. We have a couple of questions we've kind of talked about, but one says, any good sources for undercover police procedurals, talking deep cover, hardest topic to find info about? Does anyone
Can I
have
answer
any,
Yeah. I,
John, go
I-
ahead.
I think since my book is more of a spy mystery novel, I did have to do some of the research. And like I said, I did have a friend that formerly worked for the CIA, but here in the US. And she gave me some insights. But there's enough, there's some articles out there on the procedure. And that would be, deep cover would be more like espionage, the dead drops, how to communicate, those kind of things with and without technology. So if you were going to do that kind of research, I would lean more towards the espionage and spy novels.
I'd say it's commonplace in drug prosecutions and drug squads in the NYPD. There are no end of books about undercover cops and cases on which they work. I have shelves and shelves of such books, and all you have to do is read a few, and you'll find out how it works. But it's usually a drug investigation where undercover comes into play, primarily in local enforcement.
We have another question from the chat. How might one go about interviewing a 911 dispatcher to find out about that angle?
I've done that because in the book that I'm writing now, I have 911 call and a 911 response. So what I did was I contacted the county executive's office here in Dutchess County, told them what I was doing because I believe that they were the office that controlled 911 or the dispatch. So they introduced me to the chief of the dispatch at Dutchess County, and we arranged for me to go and interview and do a tour around the 911 facility. So I got to see the dispatcher, because one thing about dispatch is that there's a specific list of questions that get asked. And when I'd written my scene already, I came back, I totally had to rewrite it because I had it absolutely wrong. There's a code, there's a book, they're color-coded questions. It's all laid out for them. So that's a thing to do. Contact your county, and they should direct you to their 911 dispatch. And hopefully they'll be as welcoming as ours were here for me to go through. Couldn't take any pictures, and I also can't quote anything that, in other words, quote any cases that I observed, but at least I was able to get procedure. And that's really important because you don't want to screw that up.
And I think it's also different for every police agency, because I know, at least
Yes.
when I was working, but this was a long time ago, in our actual police department, the dispatch was right there. So, I mean, we always walked by them. So it wasn't a separate entity.
Well,
So-
here in Dutchess County, because there's so many small municipalities, the city of Poughkeepsie has their own 911. But if you go out to the smaller communities like Rhinebeck or Millbrook, they're the ones that first go to that county facility. So they cover a broader geographical area. So as you say, Kathy, every area is different.
Yeah. So to all your writers, make sure you know what your jurisdiction is going to be, where
Right.
your 911 calls are going, because
Right.
it could be very different. All right. I think we had another question in that chat. How do you know which cop to take out to lunch? Do you go to the police department and ask who wants to go to lunch?
That's one way. You go to the precinct, you go to the community relations cop. There's one in every precinct. Tell them you introduce yourself as a writer, and he'll put you up with somebody. They'll find out what kind of books do you write, what kind of information you're looking for, and he'll put you together with a likely source.
Yeah.
And
And
to follow up with that, we also had a community liaison. And because I worked in cold case, we would get interest in some really old cold cases around the turn of the century. I had a woman that came from San Francisco, and our public liaison officer actually set that all up. And it was so easy. She actually came twice, and I don't know if she ever wrote the book, but we were more than happy to work with her on this extremely interesting case. I believe it was from 1903, which we still had the records for. So if you're, it doesn't even matter, what the era is. Most cops, like I said, are more than willing to share what they know.
Yeah. Well, and I'll kind of piggyback off that in a way. When I lived in Texas, and that's where I was a police officer, that's where I first joined Sisters in Crime. And through going to those meetings, one of the other members of Sister in Crime asked if she could ride along with me. So, of course, I had to get all the go ahead. We had to do all the paperwork. But yeah, she actually came and rode along with me one night. So that's another option for writers as well.
Police reporters are a wonderful source. Newspapermen who cover police, the police beat, are a source of cops they can refer you to, and my experiences are always happy to.
Mhm.
They like to talk about themselves and cops they know as much as cops do, and so if you can find a police reporter, you'll be a tremendous source for it.
There's also Writers Police Academy too in North Carolina. So if you're really interested and want to get immersed, I believe that they have an outing every year. So it's just Writers Police Academy. You can Google it and check that out.
All right, we have a bunch of more questions coming in. Let's see. What about state police? There's not a lot of information out there. Anyone want to talk about troopers? They're a little bit of a different breed no matter what state.
Troopers are the most secretive cops I've ever encountered, and it's as if they operate in a different world from the rest of us. They're, for instance, up New York State, it's just commonplace when you're stopped on a DWI potential arrest. They do the street enforcement, the tests on the street, and normally they're filmed by a camera on the radio car. No such cameras on New York State trooper cars. And if they take you in for the breathalyzer test, in every precinct I've ever heard of, in every city, it's filmed. Your performance of the test is filmed, but not in a state trooper barracks in New York State. They don't film anything. Well, that's time-honored good advice for a cop. Never write anything down and never have anything filmed so you don't get into trouble. But really, the New York State troopers follow that to a T. I'm not a fan of state troopers, in other words.
All right. Let's see. More and more questions coming up. Here's one. Do you have any recommendations for specific sources of information concerning police procedural and spy activity during the Great Depression?
Oh, that's specific.
Oh,
Any historical knowledge out there, guys?
oh, that's a tough one.
Actually, I'll touch on the spy part. The Russians kind of seeded our entire government during the 20s and 30s with, we'll call them spies. They referred to them as associates. And all those people were in very interesting places. Department of Ag, State Department, Department of Treasury, etc., when World War II broke out. So the paranoia of the Russians, they foresaw that they needed people in place long before anybody else did. So there were people during the Depression that they reached out to and who became both active and we'll call them passive communists or communist sympathizers. So there's a number of books about that out there.
Interesting.
Another resource that people might want to check out is, I know Buffalo has one. I don't know about other police departments, but I'm going to assume they do. There's a retired Buffalo cop who runs a website called Buffalo Police Then and Now. And he goes through the history of the Buffalo Police Department on this website, and he has pictures and he has case files, and he highlights, you know, some well-known cases from the area and the squads that we used to have. You know, we used to have a mounted unit. We used to actually have a cartography unit, which there was a whole squad that did nothing but make maps, which hasn't existed in, you know, 40 years, but he's got a whole section on that. And it's got a lot of great history of not just the Buffalo Police Department, but just policing in general. If you're going to write, it's called Buffalo Police Then and Now. If you want to look up sort of historical police work, because really before DNA, most of the police departments across the country were pretty much operating the same. You know, the evidence was fingerprints and witness statements, and you know, some physical evidence. It just wasn't high tech like it is now. So that's a great resource for historical police work.
Yeah, as for background material for 'em, you gotta remember that police procedurals are all about how a detective investigates a crime and puts together a case for court. So it'll involve forensics. It'll involve frequently in shootings. It'll involve the forensic squad and the bullets, the comparison of bullets with the gun. If they're a gun, even if they don't have a gun, they can tell you what kind of gun was used. And there's also the DNA, of course, that you mentioned. DNA has only been active since 1984 in England. They started to use it for the first time in England, discovered it for the first time in England. And here it only caught on slowly. Back in 1996 in Queens, I did a DNA trial. And I don't even remember what the charge was, but DNA was involved. And the big thing about a DNA is the probabilities that the guy you've got whose DNA we have is likely the guy who did it. So the way they phrase it always is after they do the DNA examinations, comparing the forensic evidence to the defendant's DNA, they say it is probable up to 1 million. They say there aren't the ratio, it is probable up to 1 million that this man's DNA is the perpetrator's DNA, or that that it would be 1 million to 1 that anybody else's DNA was involved in this case. Now, back in 1996, when I did that case, we put on a DNA expert, and his testimony was that the probability that it was that out of 4 men, 1 in 4 men would have the same DNA. You know, I'm talking about millions in the probability. Back in 1996, you were saying 1 in 4. That's how far we've come.
We have a great question in the chat, and oh, I just lost it. Here it is. How much accuracy are you willing to sacrifice for the sake of the reader's enjoyment? Or do you think it's necessary at all to sacrifice any accuracy?
I would say not so much accuracy, so much as you have to sacrifice. Cases take a long time, you know, to build from the crime to the investigation, to the arrest, to the prosecution. Law and Order does it great in 1 hour, but in real time, that could be 2 years, you know. So it's not so much the accuracy as you find yourself condensing a lot to make it palatable for the reader. You end up, I mean, as cops and lawyers, you end up waiting around a lot for things. You're waiting for a DNA report. You're waiting for someone to call you back. You're waiting for a witness to show up. You're waiting, and so you have to cut out all that, the stuff that isn't so interesting and condense it just to, I guess, the action points, for lack of a better word.
Well, you got to surround it with exciting scenes, with exciting people, with exciting events. The accurate stuff, goes in there someplace, but it isn't the main purpose. The purpose is tell a story, and the accuracy is part of the story, as you say.
I believe that readers want to learn something when they're reading your book. So I always strive to be extremely accurate about anything that I'm telling or holding myself out to be a specialist about. For example, you're not going to change the Miranda rules. I mean, the rules are, the law is the law is the law, as far as I'm concerned. It's the laws, it's not black and white, the law is gray, but it's how you interpret the law. And I think that's the beauty of the law, that Bob is an attorney on one side and myself as an attorney on the other side could be reading the same law, but we're looking at it from different perspectives. So I don't think that the accuracy is going to change. It's the interpretation that's going to change. And we as the writer are the interpreter.
Well, actually, I agree with you, because the point is to convince the reader that what she's reading is believable, right? Now,
Right.
You don't necessarily have to be so accurate to be believable. You may not be so accurate at all, but if a reader believes what they're reading is true, that's all you need, whether it is in fact true or not.
John, did you want to add anything?
I would say the same. I'm kind of a trivia person, and I do throw those little things in there every once in a while. But yeah, they have to be accurate, or they have to be completely edited out for time constraints, like Lissa said. So if you've got, if a victim is shot, sometimes that's all you need to know. If for some reason the weapon is involved, then you might need to go more in depth. And, if the weapon's a unique weapon, then you have to go in even more in depth if it's critical to the case or the story. If it's not, obviously it comes out.
Remember that you have to convince the reader that your detective really knows his stuff,
Mhm.
In order to know your stuff, you have to do the stuff that you're expected to do and what they expect you to do. Otherwise, they may find your character, your detective, not very interesting. And then
The internet is a beautiful thing. And, in my new book, I had a scene where someone was caught in a ditch, and a trench actually, and how are they going to get this person out of a trench? So I went to YouTube and Googled, how do you get a person out of a trench? And there were all of these fire and emergency services videos that are there that showed you different ways to extract people out of a trench. So, it's a really beautiful thing. If you want to know what a taser is like, you can Google a taser, Google different kinds of guns. It's there as a tool. It's a research tool, and it's there and it's free. I use it a lot. I may be wrong for relying on it, but there's a lot of information there.
We had another, go ahead.
No, go right ahead.
We had another question in the chat, which is actually something I probably should have brought up earlier. Someone asked, what exactly is a police procedural? And how does it differ from other genres? Does anyone want to take up that question?
Yeah, a police procedural is about it's usually a detective, member of a police force, could be a former member, investigating a crime. Investigating means interviewing people. You're looking for for the doer of the crime. So you interview witnesses and people and trying to find your way. And then there is the surveillance of the scene of the crime, and that's where the scene of the crime comes in. And as a cop, there's all kinds of forensics involved. There's a crime scene unit in just about every police department in the world who are charged with collecting what evidence is at the scene, marking and identifying, collecting evidence. And that's what they do, which is, and beyond that, at the heart of it is the detective, right? Now, he has to be an interesting character. He or she has to be an interesting character. Has to excite the interest of readers. Has to be a full character. Now, you may do that by quirks he has. For instance, it seems almost de rigueur that he has to be an alcoholic, particularly if he's an ex-cop, he has to be an alcoholic. But anyway, you can make this detective interesting. Frequently, they have ex-wives, usually not currently with wives. Well, otherwise it's difficult to get a girlfriend in that, you know. But the detective, the personality, the character detective is key. All the accuracy and forensics doesn't count worth a whit if nobody cares about your character, the detective.
I also think that the detective or any protagonist has to have a stake. What is the stake? It has to be personal. You know, it just can't be, oh, it's part of my job, and so that's why I'm investigating this case. There's got to be something in the past that connects them, or something in the present that connects them to have a personal reason for pursuing this particular crime. What separates this crime from all of the others, which he or she handles on a day-to-day basis?
John or Lisa, do you have any thoughts as to what makes a police procedural?
I think what separates it more from a traditional mystery or with an amateur sleuth is, one, that it's professional, you know, either a professional police officer, private investigator, or a lawyer. And I think it doesn't necessarily have to be a Agatha Christie type, you know, reveal at the end. A lot of times a police procedural is a slow burn, taking you from the scene of the crime, you know, through the investigation and all the steps of the investigation, a lot of times all the way up to the courtroom, if it's a courtroom thriller, you know, through the procedure of the courtroom, all the way up to the verdict. You know, could the perpetrator be a surprise? Yes, but it doesn't have to be. You can have the person who did it be, you know, known from the very beginning, and have the police officer or lawyer or private investigator working to find the evidence to put that person in jail, which can sometimes be even, you know, as far as story writing, even more tension. Can they find the evidence to put this supervillain that they know did it, you know, can they gather that evidence and put that person away? So I think that's the main difference between that and the traditional Agatha Christie type, who I love Agatha Christie. I'm not knocking it at all. She's my favorite author. You know, mystery where there's a sort of a big reveal at the end, or a big twist at the end, where all the characters are, you know, sat down, and, you know, the plot is explained, you know, the mystery is explained. I think that's the big difference.
John?
Yeah, and I think a really good police procedure lets the reader know how the sausage is made. The stuff that's behind the scenes doesn't have to be big reveals, but just how the court clerks really run the court as opposed to the judge, or again, and I'll say women traditionally, the office clerks in a police department, really help a police department function and flow. But also just the little foibles that everybody has, but it all kind of comes together in the name of justice.
One of the things about police procedurals, there are a lot of the techniques of investigation. For instance, the forensics. There are a lot of books out there, and there are a lot of experts. For instance, Michael Bodden is probably the most famous medical examiner. He's now retired. He used to be in New York City. He's written a number of books on the procedures of autopsy investigation. Also, there's Judge Gerald Scheindlin, who's the husband of Judy, Judge Judy Scheindlin, and he's written a book on DNA, and they're all in paperback and easily acquired, and there's a crime scene, stuff like that. And there are names that are well known. Michael Bodden, Henry Lee, Dr. Henry Lee in Connecticut, who's a famous ME, and he's hired by private lawyers to do a private autopsy when, on behalf of the defendant who's being prosecuted with the state's autopsy. Henry Lee, Michael Bodden, and I'll be happy to anybody who contacts me on my website, robertknightley.com. I'll be happy to give you a list of people and their books.
Can I also tell people that if they're interested in legal procedure, if you're in New York State, you can go to the Office of Court Administration for New York. And they've got all kinds of links about different types of cases and how to get, downloads and free pamphlets about how juries are selected and the different types of crimes and the different types of civil cases and criminal cases. So it's the Office of Court Administration. I mean, it's a wealth of information that's there for you on the web.
Great. We have only 3 minutes left. Could I just go to each one of you and let me know, what are you working on now, or do you have a new release coming out that people should know about? Jodé, anything in the works?
Yeah, I do. My work in progress. It's I'm really close to working a super polished draft. It's called Hooker Avenue, and it's based upon the disappearance of 8 women here in Dutchess County, which occurred from I think it was around 1998. These women just disappeared. It turns out that they were all prostitutes. They were all picked up by a John outside my office and taken back to his house, and they never left the house. So the story begins with one woman who is abducted. She escapes, and that's how this serial killer is, or this suspected serial killer is unveiled to the public.
Okay, John?
I'm working on a sequel for Parabellum, but it's a slow working process, so it'll probably be another year before that's out.
Lissa?
The latest book in my cold case investigation series, it's called The Parting Glass. It's going to be released in July. It takes my main character. She has to find a stolen Picasso, and the trail leads her to Ireland. And of all the books that I've written, it was the most fun because the research into art theft was absolutely fascinating. And if you're sick of being stuck in the house and want to do some armchair traveling, I would highly recommend picking that. You could pick it up without having read any of the other books in the series, which is one of the reasons why I like it so much.
Great. Bob, do you have anything coming out?
Nothing coming out because I have to finish it before it'll come out. Got a memoir I've been working on for 10 years. I've got a collection of my short stories. I've written one, and there's only 11 to go, based on criminal trials I've had, which are interesting to me anyhow. And a half a dozen short stories I'd like to get to. So I hope to live long enough to do some of that. Yeah.
All right, well, and I think that is about time. Oh, exactly, 4:30. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for everybody coming to see all of us. You can check the chat link to get these guys' books. And also I see a request for Robert to write book 3 in your series. But thanks, everybody. I think our
Thank
time is
you.
up.
Thanks for coming.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for coming.